there's been a video that I think has been underreported out of the Biden administration. This is Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, who was holding a town hall, but for his own employees, essentially. And a woman comes up to the microphone and asks him about the creation or the potential creation of what she calls an information czar. This supposed or this information czar that is yet to be created would essentially be, right, you can get to that in a moment, would essentially be someone who oversees quote unquote disinformation online. So our audience knows that oftentimes what we talk about in the show, big tech labels as disinformation. Big tech is controlled by big government. So I want to show this video, and then I'd like to hear your reaction for what's going on behind the scenes here. If we could take a look at this.
As you just said, research that I've done at the War College indicates that our interagency response to information warfare by foreign actors is insufficient and not very well coordinated. So given state actors like Russia are so good at this, how can we enhance our capabilities using influence AI to both identify disinformation and create our own narratives? And since you just talked about breaking down silos, what do you think about the idea of having sort of an information czar, maybe at the National Security Council, or another actor that will have sort of an overall view on protecting information resiliency in our domestic environment? Thanks.
It's a good question on the information czar. One challenge, just to be straightforward, is that a lot of these questions around information operations, around public diplomacy, around the voice that America uses to speak to the world, bleed over into questions of propaganda or politics. And so the question is, should the White House be the central locus for this effort, or should it actually be distributed to an agency? Should this be a case where you have a lead agency model? One agency is in charge and they're sort of running it, but it's kept one step removed from the White House. I think on the czar, that's something we've been grappling with and thinking about. Across the national security enterprise and under NSM2, most decision-making does get kind of brought into the NSC process, but this may be an area where actually a lead agency model is a more effective way of setting up for long-term success that insulates this from the to's and fro's of politics on both sides. That's not just, by the way, about the election interference issues. It's about the larger question of how we decide messages we communicate, how we decide what messages we combat, which are fraught.
Mike, please give me your take on this, because it's hard to know. I feel like we could break this down sentence by sentence, and every single phrase out of his mouth is deeply troubling.
Yeah, the whole thing here is an elaborately constructed lie on Jake Sullivan's part, but you have to understand the fine line he's walking here. So we already have multiple U.S. agencies who are already doing this, but it's a little bit clumsy right now. Let me walk through the history a little bit. So in 2014, we set up a lead agency, an information czar, to govern social media speech. It was called the Global Engagement Center out of the State Department. And it was set up so that the U.S. government could tell social media companies what kind of ISIS groups to censor online. Basically, it did this AI influence scraping that the lady from the U.S. Army War College, which, by the way, there's hundreds of millions of dollars that are spent on developing these AI scan and ban technologies. So that was originally created by DARPA, this AI natural language processing technique that she's referring to, in order to determine people who talked like ISIS on Facebook and Twitter, what kind of words, prefixes, suffixes they used, hashtags. And then the Global Engagement Center would serve as an information czar to Facebook, to YouTube, and Twitter, and tell them what accounts, what networks, what slogans, what hashtags to ban. That was set up in 2014 under a sort of counterterrorism, counterinsurgency program. The issue was then 2016 happened. 2016 saw Brexit, which the U.S. State Department hotly contested and tried to stop. And then it saw the election of Donald Trump, which was basically the end of the grand vision that the State Department had at the time towards Atlanticism. And so what they did is they took all this infrastructure they already had at state for countering terrorism and insurgency and simply put it under their pro-democracy banner for counter-populism. Counter-populism in the US, counter-populism in Brazil with Bolsonaro, counter-populism in France with Marine Le Pen, populism in Italy with Matteo Salvini, in Spain with the Vox Party, in Germany with the AfD Party. It became the entire world. You could control and censor speech in every country on God's green earth, because if there was a populist party who was rising to power or who was popular on social media, the State Department had a channel to tell the social media companies to ban everything they said, all of their key accounts and networks and amplifiers. And then they started getting into some trouble around this that basically went off without a hitch, where the State Department, USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, the Department of Defense, and our intelligence services all worked in concert, building that censorship technology that was referred to in the first part there, and then centralizing it under the Global Engagement Center at the State Department. Interestingly, that was set up by a guy named Rick Stengel, who was the former managing editor of Time magazine. He proudly called himself Obama's propagandist in chief. He was the undersecretary for public affairs. As soon as Trump won the election and he was ousted from office at the State Department, he wrote an op-ed and then a full book calling for the end of the First Amendment, despite his previous job being exporting it, because social media can lead to people like Donald Trump being elected. And he is currently, by the way, on the board of advisors for NewsGuard, one of the largest for-profit censorship firms in the world. NewsGuard, by the way, who just targeted Zero Hedge and a dozen other folks, along with the whole Ben Shapiro, Tucker Carlson, Media Matters push just this week. But fast forward to what Jake Sullivan's response to the question was, and he was saying, we're looking at this very closely right now. The blob is still in the aftermath of this Disinformation Governance Board disaster from 2022. So
Scary
a lot of
Poppins. We remember her.
Yes, right. Now, a lot of people were saying that was a Ministry of Truth that was being created at DHS. And technically, the folks who said it wasn't were correct. It was not, the Disinformation Governance Board was not the Ministry of Truth. The Ministry of Truth was already there at DHS. It was called CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, tucked in some nebbish insular sub-agency of DHS that no one had ever heard of. But it had already been working to censor the internet domestically, targeting tens of millions of Trump tweets and YouTube videos, all under this banner initially of stopping Trumpism because it was backed by Russia. And so this is another dirty trick, by the way, that Jake Sullivan is leaving unstated here. This is all under the banner of stopping foreign influence. But then all they need to do is have a rogue intelligence assessment that foreign country is supporting Donald Trump. And then what they do is they say, well, listen, even if it came from a U.S. citizen, it's being amplified over there. So therefore, it's part of a Russian campaign. And so therefore, we get to use the CIA or the DOD or the State Department or USAID to cram down on the social media companies to force the censorship of this narrative, of this news cycle, of this political network, because it's beneficial to a hostile foreign adversary. This is the dirty trick they use to get jurisdiction over every American tweet, despite us supposed to be having a First Amendment protection. But essentially what's happening here is they got in trouble with the Disinformation Governance Board centralizing this. Right now, every major national security equity in our entire panoply, state, USAID, DOD, CIA, NSA, and then all the funded swarm army of NGOs and for-profit firms that do the contracting work for that. It's a big mess right now because DOD makes its own determination about what to censor. So does state. So does USAID. This is like a sort of, if you recall, there was a funny situation in Syria in 2016 where CIA-backed paramilitaries were fighting DOD-backed paramilitaries. And so you had the CIA sponsoring one side and the DOD sponsoring the other side, and sometimes they conflict. And sometimes the social media companies get conflicting. So there's no centralization of that. And when they tried to centralize that at DHS, they got in a lot of political trouble over it. So what he's proposing to do is to remove this from the political process by, instead of having the typical coordinator of all of these, the National Security Council do it, they'll park it away at state or USAID or DOD. And already the main one that they set up to do this at state, the Global Engagement Center, is reeling politically because it was crushed during the Twitter files. Because it turned out when the Matt Taibbi, Michael Schellenberger, Twitter files were published, and then it was put on a jumbotron in front of Jim Jordan, and they were sued multiple times in multiple lawsuits, both by state AG-led actions and by private lawsuits. So they're under a lot of fire. So they need to find a new cover in order to centralize this censorship leviathan they've already created.